Welcome, everybody, to our monthly AI meetup. Just so you know, we do meet virtually every month. Typically, it's on the first Thursday of the month, so tonight is an exception, and thank you for joining us on a Wednesday. We also have a full lineup of guests into the new year, actually. So if you're not already on our meetup page, be sure to visit us and you'll get all the reminders for the upcoming sessions if you haven't already registered. For those of you that are in the Minneapolis-St. Paul area, which is most of you, we're thrilled to welcome you to join us for our first Applied AI conference. This will be a one-day event on Friday, November 4th, and it will be in person. So we will all get to meet each other. It's going to be at the Northern Star Scouting, which is the base camp building at Fort Snelling. And since it's in person, a space is limited. Justin will be dropping links and information in the chat. So feel free to check that out once he gets all that information in there. Tonight, however, we are so excited to have you joining us so we can learn about Carolyn Cinder's Feminist Data Set project using art, data, and technology to combat bias. Carolyn is a critical designer and artist who examines intersections of artificial intelligence, abuse, and politics in digital conversational spaces. She has worked with many prestigious institutions, including the United Nations, Amnesty International, IBM Watson, and the Wikimedia Foundation, just to name a few. And currently, she's a fellow with Ars Electronica AI Lab with the Edinburgh Futures Institute. Carolyn, we're so thrilled to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I turned my video on for a second so you could all see my face. I'm going to turn it off while I present because I'm going to be trying to use an iPad. I was telling Justin and Allison, I have long COVID, so I don't know if I can stay for the whole 90 minutes because I get really bad joint pain and exhaustion from my long COVID, but I am really glad to be here. All of you, I hope you find it interesting. I will also preface and say that this is an art project that I'm presenting. And I think it's important often when talking about technology-based art projects to recognize that art sometimes is made in different ways than per se the way we would make human-computer interaction-based research work or the way we would make computer science-based research work. So I think let's expand or have a little expanded mindset here to think about the project, because I think that's probably the best way to view it. But yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here. Let's see if my iPad will work for me. Fingers crossed that this works. Can you guys see everything?
Looks great.
Okay, great. And you don't see your Zoom videos on the screen.
And we don't see your notes.
Okay, wonderful. Great and great. For y'all that are just joining, Allison and Justin were watching me struggle for 10 minutes with trying to figure out displays on an iPad, along with just trying to show my presentation. And now it looks like, there we go. So this is a presentation I sometimes give to talk about the research work that I do. So there's three parts to it. I think I'll probably just do the first two parts. So hi, I'm Caroline. I'm an artist and researcher, and I work at the intersections of civil society and the private sector, looking at the impacts of technology and in society, its effects on marginalized groups. My background is in photojournalism research. But yeah, so this, my interdisciplinary background has provided this way of looking at what I call research storytelling. And so that means that I'm looking at all different kinds of ways to sort of think about research and technology through skills I honed as a photojournalist that I'm then applying to technology-based research work that I do. So I have a master's in design technology from the Interactive Telecommunications program. as Allison mentioned, I worked with IBM Watson. I was a design researcher there. And now a lot of the work I do is what we'd call civil society research work. So civil society sits adjacent, one could say, to government in a way, and is looking at, or at least what I look at, is digital human rights. So what I do is I do a mix of qualitative and quantitative research work, looking at how technology impacts society. But then for me, what I do is I take that research. So this is my current workflow you see here, these 3 steps. So I take this research that I do because it's practical to me. It creates something that wasn't there. It tests a hypothesis to see if something works or doesn't. But then I take that and I try to think about, well, like, what is the way you can apply this in society? And this is the second step that we could think of as activism or advocacy. Activism and advocacy build off that practical research, and it can start to create different kinds of solutions. Some of those solutions don't necessarily have to be tested in the way that we test academic research. What I mean by that is if I were running, let's say with one of my projects, like an IRB-based research project in a university lab, different kinds of solutions you propose would have to be tested. In civil society, for example, we can work with policymakers in different communities to suggest solutions, and that can be based off pre-existing knowledge, and also like different kinds of small research tests one runs. So let's say I was doing research on how a different group faces online harassment. I could work with the group to say, like, what are different stopgaps you've used, and then how do we translate those stopgaps into design? And I can also talk to a policymaker and a technologist to figure out the feasibility of those stopgaps. And then we can present them back to the community and say, are these things you would use? And so that's what I mean is, like, this activism and advocacy can be helpful in terms of taking research and building on it and providing perhaps like new ways or like new wants in the world, and sort of start to demand those wants, if you will. But then finally, the last step for me is I take the research and I take the advocacy and I try to do something else with it. And that is art. And I think art is this poetry that's necessary to help the world function. Art can help us then sort of build on the activism or advocacy and try to create new future imaginaries. It lets you be, in a way, a bit more speculative. It lets you ask a lot more experimental questions. I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is, at least for me, the way that I was introduced to technology-based art was through my master's program. And it's sort of this legacy of how technologists can make art, but how in terms of making different kinds of work to make art, you can end up creating all different kinds of innovation. And we see this particularly in the space of video and photography. So by trying to make a tool to create something creative, what one ends up doing oftentimes is creating this new form of innovation that can be applied to different areas. I think we could argue that GPT-3 and DALL-E fit in that same space. Perhaps they were made to be these generative tools, but I think if they're still also coming from a space of creative making. So what I'm interested in is how art fits into this equation and conversation. And if you were wondering why art, it's probably because I started my journey with art. Photojournalism is a form of art, or at least I like to argue. But for me, the form of art making becomes this other form of research, since it's an experimental kind of engagement. I always think it's important to also like point out, while I'm clearly an American, I'm sure, as you can tell from my accent, I am based in Europe, even though right now I'm in DC. And there's this long history in terms of schooling inside of Europe, where art making becomes a form of research. So by the process of creating and crafting and building different things, that is seen as a form of creative making, which is a form of research. And so I think a lot of my work is thinking about, well, what are these different kinds of research? So again, quant or qual or academic-based research in conversation with civil society, or activism-based research in conversation with creative making art research. And I think that's probably like the best way to think about all the different stuff I'm looking at. Which is why one of the ways I describe my work is research-driven art. So it's art that's driven and shaped by research, be it quantitative or qualitative. I don't make data visualization. Well, I do make some data vises, but not frequently. But probably the better way to think of my work is not data data visualization, but data driven and interested in deeper questions around data. Or the way I think of it is, what if one made technology-based art, but with the same principles as photojournalism? So like photojournalism, research-driven art uses a specific structure and a sense of purpose to constrain it. The constraints work like much how the skeleton works. While they stabilize the practice, just as the rib cage stabilizes the body, they do not define the entire practice nor keep it from moving and flexing on its own. So this means I'll often start with a question, but I see where the process takes me. I don't necessarily have the question or the desire to create a certain artifact drive the making process. So it's taking an art process and kind of inverting it and sort of turning it on its head in a way. And a lot of things I'm trying to do with my art practice is explore different kinds of usefulness. In late May in 2020, after the US erupted in protest for Black Lives Matter, I saw a number of critics online.
Carolyn, do we ask questions at the end?
You can interrupt, I don't mind, yeah. I often like what I like to tell my students is we're in dialogue. So if you have questions, go for it.
So are you kind of doing, so research driven art versus data driven art are kind of a little bit different, right?
They can be,
because from what I'm thinking, data driven, meaning that the data is something happened before and it's historical thing, and you're trying to kind of use it to create something new, something different based on the data or based on historical information or historical data, where research can have the form of data, but it also, the innovation will come based on not just data, but on some hypotheses or postulates or things that will make the art a little bit more different or new than the previous art, I would say. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that's a really beautiful and fantastic way actually to think about it. So the way in which I was taught to learn about data art was either through like data visualization or art that's in like a very direct conversation with data. Either it's like a data set or it's responding to a particular like kind of area. But the way I think of research driven art is very similar to how you've described it. And I'm often really, so when I get into an idea, I really like to think about and play with that idea and sit with it for a really long time. So a lot of the research that I do will be related to themes that I'll probably be exploring for my entire career. Like one of the areas I look at is consumer safety and technology products, specifically artificial intelligence. How do you make different AI systems more legible to everyday audiences? So right now I work with a UK data regulator called the ICO, that's the Information Commissioner's Office. So part of that is thinking about when the AI bill is passed in Europe, what will the UK's AI bill look like? And so in different areas and elements, one of the things to think about is, well, what is like a history of consumer protection in terms of articulating different kinds of things to people? That can take a variety of different shapes and roles. One of the things people often lean towards is labels, right? Like pop-up labels. I don't know if any of you have spent any time in Europe. I'll turn my video on. But if you have, then you've probably experienced a cookie pop-up called GDPR, right? And it can be very annoying. That's because like there's a variety of reasons for that, but I think it's often because like policymakers don't really think about like the impacts of policy directly inside of software. That is what I think about, and I've been thinking about that for for a while since I started my career looking at online harassment. And part of that is then thinking of, well, how do you label different kinds of harmful content? Should you, like, how do you shield that content or create different ways for people to engage with each other? And so like these topics are really quite large topics, right? And so for me, there are things I think about on a very like applied research level. Then there are things I turn into advocacy, which can be working with different think tanks, or in my case, having a fellowship with a regulator, talking to other regulators, talking to US regulators like the FTC, and trying to provide examples and provocations. I didn't think I would talk about this today, but I think it is actually relevant because one of our papers just came out on it's called algorithmic transparency. Let me pull it up. Part of what I did is I helped to design what is in this paper. I'll pop it in the chat. So this is why I'm in DC right now, is for, actually, this may be old. Hold on, let me find the new one. I think this one is slightly older. There's just a paper that came out and I'm trying to find, oh, here we go. It's this one. This is what is just launching over like a day or two ago. So let me see if this will download. Here we go. Let me show the research prototypes. No, why is this being weird? So I'm trying to like pull up the paper with like the designs I made, and I could just pull up my wireframes instead. Let me see why this isn't loading very well.
Do we need to look at the full report to see your wireframes?
No, I'm trying to pull them up for you. Oh, here we go. They did something that I don't love. They like hid the PNGs from you. Okay. I'll share my screen right now. So in this report, for example, sorry, I have a lot of tabs. Let me see if I can make this bigger. So in this report, part of what the CDT had done is they had gathered different people and run a series of tests, and this was like sort of everyday users, we can think of them, and what they wanted to learn from an algorithmic transparency report. So the setup was like, imagine you're on a website that uses a recommendation algorithm. So that could be any social network. That could also just be kind of any entertainment website you're on, let's say like Netflix or a Spotify. And how would you start to communicate all different kinds of information to users, including things like how your data is being used? Are there ways to remove your data? And then also trying to understand how the model is inferring or sort of building other data points about you. So what I did at IBM Watson is I designed a lot of dashboards. There are great things about dashboards and issues with dashboards. I really like them in the sense that I think of a dashboard as what is the kind of information you can communicate onto a page for a variety of people with different entry points in terms of understanding what it is they're looking at, knowing that you're dealing with people that are really technical, some are really not, some are really interested in data, specifically their data, and some are interested in like the wider provenance of a data set. And that could be generally how a product is gathering all different kinds of data, and they're maybe less interested in their data. So the way that you would translate that, or at least I translated that into this product, was thinking about there's all these different sections. I looked at a variety of different analytics dashboards. Things are often broken into time periods. And so there was like different things we needed to communicate. The way we also made this is we're hoping that it's inspiration for big tech companies that are using recommendation algorithms. But again, this also pulls from things that like these users said that they directly wanted. So they wanted to know like how their data is sort of being analyzed. So I just designed this by thinking like what's information I could give people to also sort of ground them in the outputs they'd be seeing. So for example, being able to sort of surface things that people could potentially remember about their time spent like on the website. So maybe they would remember that they were in 12 different group conversations, or they followed a few different places or accounts, or like they went to 3 different countries and accessed, right, the information there. All this serves, I think, is a really interesting way to ground people into data, especially if they're not extremely data literate, but they're probably literate about themselves, right? They probably understand, or they can remember, or they have, different sort of emotional ties, or like they are remembering what they've done online. And so this becomes, I think, a good way to sort of ground people in what it is they're looking at, and then also sort of teach them how the interface works by grounding them into something that they're already familiar with or an expert in, i.e. themselves. Then that becomes the way to sort of teach them or show them, well, what is the recommendation algorithm doing? And then also, like, how is their data accessed or used? And then how does that data then, right, interact with like the greater system? So this is one of the PNGs that we made. Let me go to the second prototype. So the first one is when you clicked on your data, this is your inferences. Inferences is a word that the research team chose. I don't know if I would have chosen that word. I probably would have done like a bit of user testing and been like, what do you think an inference is? But in this case, an inference is like what the model is inferring about you. And so we also try to tell you that. And so this is different kinds of information that from a lit review, we know or are fairly certain that social networks are gathering about someone. So your demographics. So some of this is what I think of as like hard data, in the sense that like the user gave that data to the platform, like their locations. Oftentimes we offer up aspects of our demographics in just filling out a form of signing up. We may follow news sources or post things, and we may friend people, right? So some of these things are much harder or stronger ties in the data because it's user given. And then some of this, again, is things that can be inferred. So this middle line you see where it says sexuality, religion, disability, socioeconomic level, political affiliation. Some of these may be things that are not necessarily user given. If you follow, let's say, like a political page or political party page, that is like a much stronger tie, but it doesn't also say that you're definitely that, like that political identity. So then there's other data that would be sort of surface and then further determine your political identity. And then lastly, down here, we have entertainment, personality, fashion, and fandoms. So I was also trying to pick things that I thought would resonate with people, but then also were directly pulled from research from this lit review of different inferences, if you will, that we felt like fairly, like extremely confident are being gathered. And then again, you see the locations here. Let me close that. Yeah, so this is like the inferences. Let me go into this next one. So this is like another view of that same page, where if you clicked on one of these, like political affiliation, because the previous one was location, this is where you see like a further breakdown of content that is saying like, this is how we're determining this political affiliation. So it's like 101 pieces of content you clicked on, like left up or lingered on, you joined a group, you clicked on 2 political ads, you like left this many comments on this kind of political like leaning post, and you've like click through and read this many URLs. Feel free to interrupt me. I know this is not art. So if this is not interesting, we can go back to the presentation. I also can't see anyone's faces, so I cannot tell if this is enjoyable at all.
This is fascinating. The White House just released their updated AI Bill of Rights, and this is very timely.
Yeah, I've been meaning to go through that. But I have not yet.
This seems to fall sort of under the term of explainable AI. Is that true?
Yeah.
You're kind of trying to explain why some of these things are happening to people.
Yeah. So I would argue it definitely falls under that. And I think in CDT's vertical they have different groups and themes in terms of where they place a budget and whatnot. And I think this falls under their explainable AI project. One thing to sort of zoom out and talk about is like why I'm showing this is like when legislation is passed, right? So with GDPR as the example, because I want to sort of, I realized I didn't make a strong enough tie, and I really want to make sure I clarify this. Like GDPR popped up because there was a law that talked about transparency and consent in terms of ad tracking. And the ways in which that got interpreted was, well, we need people to like consent into ad tracking and have a way to reject or whatnot. And then there's a variety of reasons as to why that got friction filled. I think one of those reasons is no one really sat down and said, well, like, what is the ideal user experience once this is implemented, and what kind of impact does that directly have on products? So this is like the sweet spot that I work in. So the reason it relates to this is like the European AI Act, when it comes, will probably have something about explainability and transparency. What it may not have is like an emphasis on legibility or ways to actually interact with it. And so part of doing this kind of research is you hope that this gets referenced in those laws, so it becomes a way to inform regulation versus having companies take the regulation and have to interpret it. And so what happened with GDPR, the reason it was so uneven is it fell on the companies to try to interpret the law and then apply that to a product. Some companies will try to interpret it to like the spirit of the law, and some companies will interpret it as, what can I do that is like technically legal, but is like not embodying the spirit of the law. And I think I have actually a really quick example of that in my presentation. Let me see. Oh yeah, I have it. I'll show it to y'all. So this is what I mean by this sort of interpretation. This is how a company, I think this is in 2020, interpreted GDPR. So like you see accept all cookies, it really pops out. It's like you want to click it, but like, where's the reject? If you click on cookie settings, it's hidden under here. This is more true to the spirit of what the GDPR law was, right? This company is doing something that is very legal. Like they will probably not get fined, but this is something where it is a bit of trickery. I call this a dark pattern. And it's different from something where it is actually implemented correctly, right? So we can see these different interfaces, and these are all technically legal under GDPR. And so one of the things we are going to encounter or run the risk of is like having this strange interpretation of different kinds of AI related regulation. So part of what can be done is you can like publish a lot of stuff, and then like a bill can sort of cite or footnote it or like point to it. And then that can be ways in terms to like impact that regulation without including wireframes in bills. Though I do think we should have wireframes, but there's a lot of reasons people don't want to do that. And that can be you're being like almost overly prescriptive. And there's always an exception to a rule, right? So if someone says like all transparency reports, right, have to look like Caroline's wireframe, which I'll share my screen again, I'm sure there's probably like some scenario in which like you wouldn't want this wireframe, right? Like this maybe wouldn't work for your product. This is kind of what makes it, I think, at times harder to like try to regulate software, particularly when we talk about things like explainability, because explainability, I think, for it to be really legible to the like all consumers, including non-technical consumers, design has to do a lot of the heavy lifting in that, right? So anyway, I can dive quickly back into that, or I can pause if you guys have any questions or thoughts.
I don't think it's a question, really, it's a thought, because it came up on in our Slack channel today. Like, what's the usefulness of all this stuff if there's no fines or any penalty for people not following it?
So There probably will be fines.
Okay.
They may not be decided upon right now, and they may not be like present in the bill, but like GDPR does result in fines. I mean, a lot of companies get fined a lot and they keep breaking the rules like Facebook.
Yeah.
Um,
But what about some of
but
these new AI bills, like some of the stuff related to AI and stuff that you're working on that are still kind of new? Are there planning to be fines in there at all? Have you seen any of that?
so I mean, like when the European AI bill happens, like the result will be fines.
Mhm.
Like GDPR resulted in fines.
Mhm.
So even if they're not, at least my understanding, if they're not explicitly mentioned, like they usually result in fines.
Okay.
But I'm not like totally, ironically, I'm not like actually an American policy expert. I don't know how often our laws result in fines. But I imagine there's going to be a lot of class action lawsuits if or when the AI bill happens. Class action lawsuits don't happen as frequently in Europe. It's not the US is like a litigious society, but we're also like a laxed one in terms of regulation. Europe is not litigious, but it's very regulated. So like I would imagine that there's probably going to be a lot of class action lawsuits. And
More
that
in-
will like result in fines.
That would be more in Europe than the US, I would say, right?
Oh no, the class action lawsuits I think will happen in the US. Like I think a bunch of consumers will probably get together and like file something if we have an AI bill and a company isn't adhering to it. Whereas in Europe, what will happen is like the different regulatory offices either in the different countries or there'll be like a European Union fine that will happen. So that's why, for example, with Cambridge Analytica, when they were heavily fined in the UK, and that's why an American professor, David Carroll, sued them in the UK. So he found a UK barrister, Ravi Nayak, who works a lot in data protection, and they were able to sort of sue and bankrupt Cambridge Analytica in the United Kingdom, but he couldn't do that in the United States.
Interesting.
But these are just, I mean, like I'm again like not a massive expert in US law, but my hypothesis is like probably class action lawsuits or a lot of fining that will happen in Europe when the European AI bill comes into play.
But what it looks like is that there's a big shift about not accepting black box AI
Yeah.
and tracking and all of these types, and have more transparencies to the user about what are they collecting from you and what are they using them for and things like that. Is that correct?
Yeah. So for example, in Europe, there is different kinds of data protection law. So already, for example, I should be able to like remove personal data from a lot of, or actually I should be able to remove it from like any website or product, regardless of if it uses artificial intelligence or not. So like if let's say you're operating, let's say like in the UK, and you have a product that is going to give me really great article recommendations. And so what you need from that is like different information about me. If you don't have a way for me to remove my own personal information, you can be fined, and you would be fined by like the data protection regulator, which is the group I work for. So like that's just already kind of like that's already written in certain laws. What will probably be put into law or regulated in Europe and the UK will be this idea of transparency, right? And explainability. So trying to explain or show evidence or proof as to what that black box algorithm is doing. What will be harder, and this is probably where we're going to have a lot of GDPR related friction, is how do you do that? And how do you do that in a way that's like cohesive and also is fulfilling like that spirit of the law? So like the algorithm transparency research I put in here, like that's one of the ways like we're trying to inform that regulation, is providing that kind of example of, well, is this what a transparency report could look like? And does this do a good enough job, right, of explaining it? So for example, it's actually a perfect segue into like the next slide or the next screen that I made. So like this, for example, it was like section 2, how does the recommendation algorithm work? I thought there should have been way more text here to actually explain it. But one of the things I suggested we make was like something where like you can see like your data, so like just high level information about you and like some of the different posts you've actually seen and like some of the different ads you've seen when you're on the platform. So like the next one is then, so the reason why it's called a plug and play is like the next thing is that then you change, so you can edit these sides, you change your location and you change like different things about yourself. And then these other sides, like the pink things are the ones that have changed. So you're seeing how like this information affects the model in terms of how it's recommending you stuff. One of the reasons I recommended that we do that is one of the things I've noticed when I was at IBM, and I've also noticed with my students when we create different kinds of like my students and I will like create GANs, for example, because there's a lot of software now to like make GANs really quickly that they'll assemble like a small data set and then we'll generate a GAN. Sometimes like people can see the remnants of the data set, and then that in a way then sort of helps shape what it is they're looking at with the output. So if you look at the input, you can sort of then help work backwards from the output. This is that similar kind of thinking in terms of how do you really quickly show someone just a little bit of the logic so they get a sense of what's going on here. Now, this isn't like totally revealing the black boxness of most algorithms, but it does, I think, help create a bit more of an understanding. Now, like, I think under law, most likely what will happen is people have to release different kinds of code. That's at least my assumption, which I am assuming like most for-profit companies will try to fight, or at least like the big five will, primarily because they like to think of their code as like the formula for Coke. Very secret. But like that would be needed, or you would need something as like cohesive as like so like model cards for models, right, and data sheets for data sets. You would need something with also that kind of inference, but that only really works then if you're a data scientist or a computer scientist in terms of understanding what that information is. So like the spirit of a lot of regulation is like it has to work for like a common person, like an everyday audience member, right, like an everyday user. That's where like these come into play to try to help explain like this is what it's doing, or at least that was like our goal and what we were aiming for. And then I'll show this last prototype, which is really long. And I actually don't love it, but the CDT really loved it, and I'm not quite sure why. But the goal was to show like how does data move from their platform to their partners. So like incoming data is stuff like you're giving or like they're getting from other websites, maybe if they're doing like cookie tracking, right, where you've gone. And then like it goes into the algorithm and you have like this outgoing. So like here's all the different kinds of incoming data, which could be like general and public data. That could be data that they collect or data that they receive from their own partners or that they get from partner platforms, and then like data from cookie tracking. So it's this gradient of showing like more general to like more specific. So as the colors get lighter, right, that's where you see it gets more personal. Then it goes into the algorithm. We have a green box here, but it's really a black box. La la la. And then you have this section where it's like outgoing data. And so the idea is like this is interactive. You see that you can like move stuff to different sides. So the goal is as a user, you can say like, you can determine what you would like shared. You could move technically everything over into like the private data section if you wanted to, or you could decide that maybe you want to put your ad interaction history in the publicly available section, or maybe you want to move the ad interaction history into like the private or shared with specific invited users. And then you can save this, you can discard changes, and then you can delete everything. So if you're like, I want to delete all the data and inferences, you can.
So basically, you're empowering the user to do what they want when they try to interact with the AI or with the model.
Yeah.
Right.
And then, I mean, this came also out of like user testing. These are things people wanted, but also, so the CDT, while it's also like a research firm, it's also an advocacy group as well. And so one of the things one of the changes we want to see in the world, right, is that kind of user empowerment, user agency, specifically in different kinds of products. And so part of, I think part of what was the interesting kind of, if I put on like my UX designer, design research hat, like part of the interesting ask was, how do you make something that feels like something I would see on like one of the big five, out of FANG, or I guess now manga. Is that the acronym now that Facebook changed its name? How could I make something that looked like something they would have, but then also inform them, this is what you should have. And so that was this really interesting, like very, I don't want to say complicated, but like, you had to walk this fine line. And so that screen at the very end is probably the one that's like most likely they would not have. And if I were to go back and redesign it, I would design it a different way. CDT wanted like some of the screens to be really experimental. And I was trying to be like, if we were designing this for users right now, like you can't, like that last screen we saw, like it really shouldn't look like that. It should be really a lot bigger and longer. It would need to be like, you would need a lot more explainers, and you would need much more specific things. Like it'd have to really mimic, I don't know if y'all remember what MySpace or like early Facebook feels like, where people could really pre-populate, or they could add like hyper specific things they were interested in, you could remove them. Like this would have to have something like that, with like a level of granularity that would honestly be overwhelming for most users. And that was one of the original wires we had. And the reason I'm saying it should look like that is that is like something that would communicate more, most likely to users, again, based off dashboard best practices of this sort of granularity of things you could remove. But it is overwhelming. And so this was kind of the compromise of like, how do we gesture at like what we want without being overly prescriptive, and then also like really overly pedantic. But that wireframe is one, while I'm very proud of, it's also the one I'm like, it's the least, it's not, I mean, like if we were shipping a product, I'd be like, I don't know if I can like condone that we ship that, like I wouldn't feel comfortable saying that's product ready, but I do think it exists as a good research provocation.
Interesting.
Is it becoming more common for governmental organizations to accept this kind of outside input? And the reason I ask is, I think of the Canadian example of the Bill C-11, which is the one, if anybody has paid any attention to it at all, it's the one where the Canadian government is proposing messing with YouTube's algorithm, among other social media platforms, to only highlight content creators that are, quote, Canadian enough, but there's been no definition of what that means. And so a lot of prominent content creators who are Canadian are very upset about it, and going to Ottawa and speaking with the various members of the government. And it feels like an approach like what you've been describing would have been very helpful up front to really level set what this means, what the user experience would be like, what transparency, but instead of transparency for the user and their data, transparency for the government and their intentions.
Totally. I think so. I hadn't heard about that Canadian example. My first thought was like, oh my God, I wonder if they have like any technologists that could advise them that like that's like kind of impossible to build, and also would be so hard for them to check.
Well, that's the other thing. It feels toothless. I mean, who's going to enforce it?
Yeah.
Sorry, it froze for a second. I just heard that's the other thing. And I was like, what is the other thing?
No, it just, who's going to enforce it? It feels,
Yeah.
it feels like a command without any control.
I mean, but this does happen in regulation. Like there's definitely European regulation that has resulted in certain things. I forget what it is, but there was one where like Facebook had to give out a variety of disclosures and it was like a really small turnaround time. It was like 72 hours. And it was clear someone had written that had no idea like how tech companies are structured, and also just like that, like that's an impossible ask. Like it's, you can't get that kind of information together, even if you have like the whole team working on it. I do know that like, so at the ICO, one of the reasons that like my team exists is they had a very deep interest in bringing in like technologists and design.
Did we lose her?
Designers into the regulatory technology. What I've heard mentioned is that the only other European regulator that does this is the CNIL in France. I do know that the FTC has put out a call for technologists and designers and project managers to join, and my understanding is that they have brought in like UX designers. I think that that's really great. Like I think that the expertise of technologists and designers needs to be folded in more into regulatory spaces. Like that's why there's a lot of fellowships to get. So there's like Tech Congress to get technologists, or like working with different, like on different congressional staffs. But I do think it is like time also for designers, because if we're going to have like an AI bill in the United States, you know, how do we want actually affect, like what does it mean to sort of like make with AI? Like one of the things I often like to ask researchers, particularly those at like academic think tanks, is like, well, where would you put a transparency label on the Facebook timeline? Like, and I, you know, this is to say, like, I believe we should have transparency, but like what I mean when you ask for, or say you want transparency, and then like what does that actually look like in the product itself? And if you haven't thought about that as a researcher, you really need to or you need to hire like researchers that will think about that on your staff, because that's going to have these really widespread effects. And the last thing any of us need is a GDPR style issue on things, you know, on products that are coming from companies like Google, Microsoft, Meta, and Apple, because that will have these really widespread, really, I would argue, detrimental like effects on users. You know, like you don't want a pop-up every time you open the same app, for example.
True.
Yeah, this was fun. I didn't think this is what I would talk about, but I really enjoyed.
Yeah, we kind of ended up getting into
This was
the
really
regulatory
good.
stuff. That's good. Yeah, and we can continue to talk about that. You know, I didn't know. I'm gonna give you a quick plug here for your. I'll drop in a link to the projects on your website,
Oh yeah.
civic.com/projects. And I think one of the things that I think was in the description for the meeting tonight was to maybe talk about one of the projects, the Feminist Data Set in particular. I don't know if you were going to cover that at all on your slides, or you would like to talk about that. We can certainly talk about whatever you want to talk about. So pretty open.
Yeah, I can cover that. I know this is also fun to me as well. Because this is just brand new work that I haven't gotten to publicly talk about yet at all. So this was fun to me. I guess I can just sort of quickly try to go over Feminist Data Set. I've actually like closed my iPad. I just gave up on it.
Okay.
I was like, it just also kept disconnecting as I was presenting on the slides. Like I could see the little thing where it was just like starting to disconnect. So I mean I can really quickly talk about Feminist Data Set. And then maybe we can go to like Q&A. Yeah, maybe I can really quickly show Feminist Data Set. So the thing about Feminist Data Set is that it is an art project, and it started when I was at IBM Watson, where I had been doing a lot of online harassment research outside of work, and that's research I'd been doing while I was a grad student. And I wanted something that was inspiring and not as sort of depressing as the research I had been doing, because I had been looking at the rise of the American alt-right and Gamergate and just a lot of really sort of distressing social media data about harassment. And so I thought, oh, I'll do this project and it'll be like a year. And it wasn't a year, it's still going on. This started in 2017. So the goal of Feminist Data Set is to take intersectional feminism and use it as a framework for investigating the machine learning pipeline from start to finish. So that means that one of the things I'm exploring is, well, what is feminist data collection? And like the project is inspired by a lot of other methodologies in the space of like feminist socio-technical studies and feminist, just generally feminist technology studies, along with community activism and art. So, for example, I don't know how many of y'all know about Data Feminism by Lauren Klein and Catherine D'Ignacio. That is something we're really deeply inspired by. We're inspired by the feminist principles of the internet created by the NGO APC. We're inspired by the Feminist AI group that is out of Los Angeles. We're really inspired by the Feminist Manifest No, which is an academic manifesto on feminism and technology, put together by a variety of different HCI and STS professors from across the United States. But one of the reasons that this is an art project and not, let's say, like an HCI project is I'm really interested in experimentation and failure. And I'm also sort of really interested in, well, what happens when you try different frameworks that are outlined and actually try them under the guise of reality, and you can sort of move slowly. So if this was like a research study, we'd have a really strict time limit. We'd have very particular ways in which we can engage with people. And I think some of that doesn't actually allow for like the reality of engaging with software, right? Of seeing like where software breaks, of, you know, even under the best intentions, like things don't necessarily line up. It also lets you take time to try to course correct if an experiment, let's say, goes awry, or you're not getting, let's say, the results you want. And what I mean by that is, for example, the first step of Feminist Data Set is data collection. And I host these through workshops. So the main artifact of the art projects is actually like workshops and documentation, and then different kinds of software that comes out. But right now, you know, my best intentions of, can I gather feminist data? Well, I have a lot of data. It's all text-based. So I have a lot of texts that have been submitted, and they are, you know, overwhelmingly white and cis, and that is a problem. So what that means is like, I can choose to elongate the data collection process for as long as I want to, because I'm not hindered right by a grant. I can just sort of keep going until I feel like we've tried, or, you know, there is something that is closer to a form, let's say, of parity. I think one of the downsides is like this project, because it's an art project, then is like very difficult to fund, because it's not hard artifact driven. Like people aren't getting like a painting or a sculpture out of it. They're getting like workshops, right? Sorry, there's like questions and I can't see them. So let me stop sharing. Oh, someone has sleep. Sorry, there was like a question. That can also turn it off. So like Feminist Data Set's also difficult to photograph because it's workshops. And so like what you were seeing there were like the post-it notes that came out of an installation in some of the workshops. So like the workshops around data collection are things where I'll do a quick presentation on like, what is data? How do you structure a data set? And like, why does data matter for things like machine learning? While it's called Feminist Data Set, the data set doesn't have to be about feminism, but the text has to sort of manifest intersectional feminism. So what do I mean by that? Let's say someone submits an article on income inequality. An article that states that, like the article would need to state that like white women, Black women, Latina women, Indigenous women, and trans people of all different races are paid all different amounts, right? Because that is like true. And that's also like more true to the data, right? That like, oh, like different races across different genders are paid different amounts. And that's also true across like male genders as well, right? That like, you know, and so an article that just says like men and women are paid separately is not intersectional and cannot be in the data set. And so part of it is this kind of slow data, almost like the slow food movement, the slow data collection process, in which in the workshops, participants may end up with like one piece of text, like just one piece that they end up submitting, and they're even still not quite sure. And so part of this process is sort of rethinking, well, what does it mean to like sort of try to collect data or think about generating a data set when it's not about speed, it's about really sort of like the accuracy, if you will, inside of this. And it's also then thinking further of like, well, how does a political ideology like feminism actually manifest into data, right? And so I'm interested in those kind of really weird and squishy questions, and I'm approaching it having worked on natural image processing APIs at IBM Watson as a design researcher. So thinking about how there are some things that are perhaps easier to structure a data set around, and I've chosen quite a difficult thing, but that's also part of the process, right? So like the process with feminist data set is, well, what's a feminist way to collect data? So the actual collection itself, because I can't pay people, they're often free workshops. And so I see it as like an exchange of like, here's some knowledge about machine learning. And then do you want to submit data that you found into the data set? Well, what do we want our rules and governance of the data set to be? Because now we're all collaborators. So do you want your name listed? Like, do you want to be a collaborator in the project? Most people are like, yes, that sounds great. Great. So like when the project is installed, like officially at some point, all the participants' names will be listed. One of the things we talk about is like, how do people have access to this data set? Like, what do we want to determine as like our framework for accessing the data itself? So should we use a Creative Commons license? Should we extend beyond a Creative Commons license? Should the data set not be accessible after 10 years? Like, should we let data sets degrade, for example, and die? And I kind of think we should. Should we use something like a data sheet to talk about where we all came from and like when the data was gathered and like why we wanted to gather it? That's a great idea. Often a lot of times participants will say that they want transparency and consent in the data set. And I'm like, great, well, like we have to define that. Like, what does that mean in terms of us as a group? So like, what does consent mean? Does it mean that like all of you are submitting something, you're consenting to it? Should we ask the original authors, which is a really hard thing to do. So it's a thing we've suggested to do that like probably may not happen because a lot of the authors aren't alive anymore, you know? So maybe another workaround is like we will remove any data that people do not want here, sort of like at any process, right? So part of it's also trying to think about with participants, like when we talk about these ideologies we want in terms of technology, how do you also actually manifest those? So if we say we want like transparent technology in this use case of this project, what does that really mean? And so those are the things we try to define.
Carolyn, in system identification, which is, you know, stuff we used to do, there's what we used to call design of experiments. It's about how do you want to collect the data in a way to be able to understand the system better. And in what you start to mention all of these things, so the difficulty is that system or the model that you're trying to create through your workshop is kind of very, very difficult to understand. It's highly nonlinear. So is the challenge is kind of like, if you wanted to do this design of experiment, about how do you shape the design of experiment in this type of a model identification, I would say. Because at the end of the day, you're going to build this workshop, you're going to be capturing some data, and based on this data, you're going to come out with something, right?
Yeah. So the workshops already exist. And it is, I would say like it is very non-linear. That's also what makes it not at all academic. But one of the things I was interested in was sort of seeing like principles like different groups would put out, or like academic researchers or researchers on like how do you do like feminist or equitable or like justice-based technology. And I like those. And so for me, I took that as, well, I'll build the technology and then let's see, even if I follow the principles, like what goes wrong and like what were the concessions I had to make and like why did I have to make those concessions. So that's like actually like the output of the project is saying like I would like to try to make feminist technology. And I think the answer is like I don't think we can make feminist machine learning, but that's fine. There's a lot of trade-offs to building like anything if you're trying to make it. And so one of the things I often show is this, sorry, I like lost it. Okay, Zoom is here, great. Okay, hold on, sorry. There's like so many tabs. So this is a critical design project in which this guy builds a commercial toaster from scratch. Like he dug up and created his own iron ore. He found like iron ore in the ground. He created his own plastic toaster body mold. So like, because I'm trying to build, I guess one could argue like sort of an industrial software in a way from scratch by myself, sort of piecing together small art grants. Like my software, like my entire project is going to be like as misshapen as this toaster. So that's what I kind of mean where I'm interested in the process. And again, like with failure, like I'm building everything on a MacBook, on a MacBook Pro. Like is this a form of feminist technology, like the laptop itself? Like probably not, like I can't really verify where the silver came from. And I don't, is Apple a feminist workplace, right? Like it's hard to say. So that's what I mean, like there are trade-offs. Like I'm building software at times on top of AWS. Like is Amazon a feminist company? Yeah, and so that's kind of what I mean when I'm interested in failure is like there are concessions you have to make to try to make something work, right? And it may not be perfect. And that's kind of like, those are the questions I'm also very interested in talking about and asking, is like, when you have these sort of set of principles, like even in trying to embody them, like when did it sort of go awry? And like, why do you think that happened? Or like, why did that happen? And like, what were the steps you took to course correct that? So for example, like with all the text I have to assemble that at some point into a file, like a large text file, right? To sort of put into a model. And one of the things I've talked about is like, oh, should I like bring on people to help me? Like, well, I need help refining and training that model. What is a feminist way to work with other people? Like, what is actually like the setup with working with other people on this project, right? And so like that I think is something really important to think about is like, well, what is like sort of the structure of engagement with another person in terms of doing this work? And also like, how could I pay them equitably? And I think those are also questions that resonate with deeper problems we have in the machine learning space. If we think of like microservice workers, like mechanical Turkers. So like, what is a feminist way or an equitable way to engage with that labor force, knowing that they're like a backbone of different kinds of machine learning processes. So like that is something that also like Feminist Data Set is thinking about. And I may not have a good answer. And I'm also like, oh, really okay with the project being like, there was not enough conversation at this time or like enough documentation. And so a lot of this is like, I'll hold workshops. So like another workshop of Feminist Data Set is specifically on like microservice workers and human as a service tasks. And then also like how asking people, how would you want to work? Knowing that that's a task you have to do. How would you like to be in collaboration or engaging with someone? Like, what would you need? Like, maybe it's not being paid per task, right? Maybe it's a salary. Maybe it's other things like being given a number of tasks, but like a lot of time to complete them if you're someone's caregiver, right? And I think this also sort of resonates with deeper conversations around, well, what does it mean to be like in a remote workforce, for example? or like, I don't know if this is stuff y'all have read, but it's come up a bit, different circles I'm in, of people having to perform that they're working. So sending emails just to send emails so it looks like they're there, or making sure like their Slack button is always green instead of red, that they're online. So it's like performing productivity. And while these seem like adjacent conversations, I think, to machine learning and artificial intelligence, I do think that they are like worthwhile ones to have, because there are issues like we're also encountering. So these are like the parts of the project that like Feminist Data Set's engaging with. And one of the next steps will be, what is a feminist way to do algorithmic audits? And how do we know? And so there's like different research already out there on that. A lot of it's again on like social science-based audits of like, I think sort of looking at how the model is performing based off different aspects of like one's identity versus like a more, I think, like mathematical audit. But like that's something that Feminist Data Set will have to tackle, is like, oh, well, we used this framework someone else made, and like this is how it did or didn't work for us. So that's kind of the point of the project.
That's fabulous. That's awesome, Caroline. No, your projects page just in general is amazing. I don't know how you sleep. There's just so many different projects that you've been working on for, I mean, probably a decade or more, right?
Definitely a long time. Yeah. Yeah, I started grad school in 2012, so probably it'll be a decade very soon.
Yeah, for sure. That's amazing. I mean, we can open it up for questions here. I mean, you've been going here for more than an hour, so I want to be respectful, of course, of your time and your energy. So yeah, I don't know if people have particular questions they want to ask. Well, you kind of got into the space through, you mentioned photography, I guess, through the art side. I mean, have you taken any classes on data analytics or, machine learning or any of that sort of stuff, or just sort of self-taught along
No.
the way?
I was just sort of self-taught and like on the job. But I do actually want to go take a data analytics course, because I feel like I've gotten to a point where I'm like, there's probably better ways to do what I'm doing, and like faster ways to do it than like how I'm approaching it. So that's something I'm hoping to do in the new year,
Okay.
because it's October now. It's October right now.
I mean, you touched on so many different topics,
Mhm.
from the transparency and the explainability to the feminist data collection. And I think each one of them, is a different PhD thesis, I would say, or theses.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that is something I also think about frequently. There's like 15 dissertations in the project somewhere.
So, and you mentioned that you have students working for you on each of these projects, and they kind of.
No. I just occasionally like teach in different master's programs. And so I was teaching in a data visualization master's program. And so like one of the things we did in the program was we took the data feminism white paper, and I had all the students take the 6 principles in the white paper, there's 7 principles in the book, and try to apply it to a UN Sustainable Goals data set. And the goal, so like when I talk about students, it's like either participants of the workshops or just like classes I teach in. But the reason this is related to Feminist Data Set is the goal is also trying to get the students to think about where like intention and ideology and then like practice can differ. So like the reality of like the UN Sustainable Goals data set is that countries sort of elect or choose to return that information to the UN, and countries have all different ways of gathering their data, right? And so those data sets are also over like many years. And so there may be, quite a few years that like a country isn't contributing because the person that thought they should do it like doesn't work in that office anymore. And so part of that is, and the reason this is related to Feminist Data Set is I really sort of strive for my students to recognize that like those data sets are not bad, and they may not be like, they may not fit the data feminism principles, but does that make them like any less compelling or any less important or any less feminist in a way? And like, can we sort of say with those metrics if the UN Sustainable Goals data sets are feminist or not? And if they're not feminist, it's fine, but that doesn't mean that they're bad. And so the purpose is also I was trying to get my students to think about, like, there's a reality in which people have to operate under, right? And so just because like there are these 7 important principles, you know, there may be very real reasons like you can't do one of the principles. And so like, what are those reasons? And so that's kind of what I mean. But I wish I had students working with me on my projects. That would be fantastic. I would love. I mean, I'm gonna start hiring for one research assistant soon, but I would wish I could have more.
And I have a question about the transparency and the models that you showed in the visual models,
Yeah.
and kind of showing the features that are affecting the at least the data that the mangas or the FANG are collecting from you, and then you can
Yeah.
see what is impacting the model, that and what are they showing you in those features that are doing it. And the question is, what is the balance between transparency and the IP and the profitability of the company? And isn't that going to be some kind of a challenge to these companies who are collecting this data, but they don't want to tell you exactly what they are doing?
Right.
And the transparency and explainability is pretty much that if people can extract all of that data, they will be able to replicate what Facebook or what Google is doing on you.
I guess like that's one of the things where when I think about it from like a regulatory stance, I'm fine with being more sticks versus carrots, if that makes sense. Like I guess it's like, it's bad to say like I don't care, but it's more in the sense of like, that's not my sort of bottom line or problem maybe to solve or counteract. When I put on my regulator hat, which is like, is it a problem that I'm like revealing how your algorithm works? Because ideally from a human rights standpoint, we would know, like if I put on my human rights hat, like we would know very explicitly, or should know very explicitly, like what it's doing and why. But I understand from like a competition, like if I were to put on a competition hat, why someone would be like, absolutely not, like no. And you know, I guess inside me there's 2 wolves, but I'm perhaps sort of like less concerned about that, because again, I'm not like a competition, like I'm not like a competitions researcher, and like that's not really the way that I approach stuff. But I do recognize that reality of like there is a reason why people don't want to do that. The downside though is like with things as large as like the manga groups, like we do need that kind of insight, because they're so much larger with such a big reach versus like any other companies, maybe like Sans, IBM, and Oracle that have like come before them, right? Like Facebook has so many users, they're larger than like any nation state that's ever existed. And so I think when you like reach that scale, and you're also across so many different geopolitical countries with different regulations, the only, I think, answer that I can think of that's like sustainable for those countries, and then for like the product to continue to function and answer some of these questions, is like you have to be more transparent. And that may mean like revealing a lot of the inner workings of like how your technology works and also how your company is structured. But I just don't think that there's any other way around that. And I think that is just, they're so large.
But given that it's a private company, they want to kind of protect these models, and so that's the kind of challenge I would say about the
right.
in the question is that is the consumer data collection, will it be heavily regulated in a way that these type of models will be commoditized, quote unquote?
I mean, I guess the thing is, it's like in other countries, it already is regulated, right? Like Facebook already faces forms of regulation across the EU and the UK, and it, to our knowledge, complies for the most part because they don't want to cut a Europe-sized hole out of their market. And so that's, I think, where, like, if we think about regulation, like there's the Competition Markets Authority in the UK. I speak to them like once a week. And like it's their job to like investigate how companies, especially like software companies, are functioning, and like they then issue fines. Like the ICO, the group I work for, I think we just issued like a massive fine to Google like a few days ago, or maybe it was like Facebook a few weeks ago. But like those, I think the thing to keep in mind, and I recognize that like I'm speaking to, I think, an American audience, is that like there are like these companies are already regulated in so many different ways outside of the United States that for me, sort of asking for more transparency in terms of how their models function is just another regulation we're putting on top of them when they already are doing all these other things. So for me, it feels like not that large of an ask because so many other things, like they're already complying with so many other kinds of regulation.
Great.
Well, Carolyn, you didn't think you would make it 90 minutes and
No,
you
I
did.
I'm definitely gonna go lie down after this.
Thank you so much for hanging on until
Yes.
the very end. Any other last minute questions? We've got some more helpful links that Justin just added. And reminder, if you'd like to hear more from Carolyn, the podcast that she and Justin recorded is up. I believe he linked it earlier. So you'll have to scroll up through the chat to go find that one. I believe you've also been featured on Wired and Slate and a host of other publications. So there's lots of good Carolyn out there in the ye olde internets to be found. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us tonight.
Yes.
And we look forward to meeting many, if not all of you, at the Applied AI conference on November 4th.
Thank you. Thank you, Carolyn.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.